What do comic fans, comic shop owners, and toy collectors want from DC Comics? They want an end to the Dan Dido era at DC Comics. Nothing less than the end of the Dan Dido era at DC Comics is going to give comic fans, toy collectors, and comic shop owners the confidence to continue believing in the DC Comics brand. When they heard about the recent DC Comics Rebirth relaunch, many were apathetic. And the reason why they were apathetic and indifferent was because they saw the same editorial team in charge at DC Comics. They saw Dan Dido and Jim Lee as the co-publishers. They saw Bob Harris as the editor-in-chief. And they saw Diane Nelson as the president in charge of the DC Comics brand. And they saw that when they saw the same faces in charge offering up yet another new relaunch, they had no incentive to even be excited about this brand. It doesn't matter if Jeff Johns is writing something that will try to assemble some sort of continuity between the New 52 and the classic DC universe. No one is interested because they understand that they've heard it all before. And people are pretty much tired of hearing it before. Dan Dido's only claim to publishing is stirring up controversy. And controversy, yes, it may cause a lot of buzz on the message boards, and it may cause a lot of buzz on the blogs like my own, but it does not generate sales. What generates sales is rock solid, consistent storytelling. Rock solid, consistent storytelling is what a writer uses to build the word of mouth that will get more people buying books. And Dan Dido is a master of controversy, but he's not a master of building word of mouth. In order to build word of mouth, you have to have an editorial team in place that understands publishing. And someone who understands publishing will tell you that the only way to build word of mouth is to pretty much, for a creator like myself, to pretty much keep their mouth shut and let the storytelling do the work. A good storyteller is pretty much going to build an audience because they know how to put it on the page. And that's all that publishing is. A writer coming out or an artist coming together to put together quality stories that pretty much sell themselves to readers. But we don't get that at DC Comics. Instead, we have Dan Dido and many of the editors at the top pretty much bragging and talking and not letting the stories do the telling and the selling. They're pretty much stirring up controversy, getting people riled up, getting them upset, getting them emotional, and that emotion, is not turning into sales. Instead, people are becoming angry, they're becoming frustrated, and when they go to the store to go look at the comics, they're not seeing anything worth the hype. And comic fans, again, have a right to be upset because they're not getting quality publications from DC Comics. And I'd say they haven't been getting quality publications for a good 12 years. I mean, I look at DC Comics since Dido came in with Identity Crisis, and the brand has been on a steady road downhill. I mean, with Identity Crisis, that would have been pretty much if I was running Warner Brothers, I would have terminated Dan Dido right there. When he proposed the rape of Sue Dibney, I would have said this man is not ready for publishing comic books or publishing young adult materials, and it's time for him to go someplace else. That type of content is not appropriate for DC Comics superheroes, and it wasn't appropriate for the family audience that needs to be cultivated among DC Comics. And they need someone who can focus on creating a brand, or rebuilding the brand around families and family-oriented products. Because when I look at the DC Comics brand, it should be focused on a PG and PG-13 style content, especially for its superheroes. And the superhero content should be family oriented because that's where the big audience lies. When I look at DC Comics, the families are where it is because the fathers who read comics, people who were my age who were reading comics, they want to pass these heroes on to their sons and their daughters, and they want to share them with them. They want to make comics a family affair, and that's just not possible under the Dido era at DC Comics. He has taken the DC Comics brand and made it so adult-oriented that it's pretty much alienated most of DC's core audience. With DC Comics, again, it needs to be PG, PG-13, because Superman is a family icon. He's an icon of America. Batman is an icon of America. Wonder Woman is an icon of America. And they need to be family-friendly and kid-friendly. They need to be in PG-13 adventures. This is not the 1980s where We had writers like Alan Moore and Frank Miller making everything dark. This is a different age. We have one of the biggest baby booms going on since the 1940s after World War II, and Warner Brothers and DC Comics just aren't able to capitalize on it because they have the wrong people in charge of the DC Comics brand. And they're focused on an adult audience when they need to be focused on a family audience. I mean, it's like they're not looking at the $1 billion that Avengers made in just box office ticket sales or the billions of dollars they make on merchandising. Everywhere I go, I see kids walking around with Avengers backpacks and Marvel backpacks and playing with Marvel toys, and that's because they kept their content PG 13. Yet DC wants to go in this hard R direction, and that's not really the direction you want to go in with the DC Comics brand, especially in the publishing division, because if you're going to cultivate an audience of new readers, you want to keep it family friendly, because if the product is family friendly, guess what's going to happen? The reader is going to grow with the product. And yes, the reader is supposed to grow out of the product when they turn about 18 to about 21, but in those years from 13 to about 21, you're going to have a reader with you for a minimum of about 7 years. And if they want to stay with the product, then that's fine. But you want to make it where it's PG and PG 13, so it's family friendly and family accessible. But we're not seeing that with DC Comics, and I don't think you'll ever see it with the management that's currently there. And what people want to see instead of these rebirth relaunches is an end to this era. And the reason why they want to see an end to this era is because it would symbolize real change. It would symbolize that, again, Warner Brothers is serious about salvaging this brand, saving this brand, and preserving it for the next generation of readers, and preserving this catalog of characters for the next generation of readers. They really want to see a new person at the top, overseeing the entire DC Comics brand, and that would show everyone that DC, again, Warner Brothers is serious about creating a new vision for the DC Comics brand, setting forth a new direction for the DC Comics brand, and creating a new platform for the DC Comics brand, because the current platform just doesn't work. It has pretty much alienated almost everyone from the DC Comics brand, and worse, it has made people apathetic. Yes, Dan Dido just stirs up a lot of controversy, but these days people are indifferent. And in the publishing world, indifference is the kiss of death. When people are indifferent regarding a product, that means they have moved on. And when I listen to the chatter on the message boards and I read the blogs, most people are not talking about DC Comics. Most people aren't concerned about DC Comics. And most people pretty much have seen them as an afterthought. And that's because this new 52 gimmick has pretty much gone on for way too long. It's been 5 years since Dido launched the new 52 back in 2011. And now we look at the brand, DC Comics brand, and in 5 years, we've gone from the books having a huge surge in the beginning with those new #1 issues to DC Comics losing 10% of its market share, and comic shop owners pretty much saying that they're going to start ordering less comics because comic shop owners have taken a huge hit over the last 5 years with this new 52. They have sat down and watched as sales of DC Comics have plummeted in comparison to Marvel Comics and indies like Image, Boom, Dynamite, and many others who have watched their audiences grow as a result of this DC New 52 relaunch that has pretty much gone sour. Because when comic fans saw that their favorite DC superheroes weren't returning, they decided to go out and pursue other characters. And they've been doing that for the last, I say, about 2 to 3 years in regular numbers. And that's been happening because, again, DC Comics insists on going on a direction that has not worked. And pretty much they were told from day one it wasn't going to work. I heard many comic fans saying that they weren't going to buy it, and the few that did bought like maybe 2 or 3 issues, and then after that stopped buying altogether when they saw that the storylines weren't going anywhere. And some of the books pretty much got canceled before anything reached the first plot point. So a lot of people look at the DC Comics brand and they look at the comics that were coming out of that new 52, and they got frustrated. And then they saw more gimmicks, more crossover arcs that went on for that took 50 or 60 issues to complete, and they got really again frustrated and tired. And they look at again those DC comics that are coming out, and in addition to the new universe, they're looking at the story model, and they're not seeing a story model that allows them to enter into comics and just start reading that like I grew up with back in the 1980s and the early 1990s. All they're seeing are these long drawn out arcs that take up the entire comic catalog and take at least 6 months to a year to complete, and that's something a reader is just not going to do with comic books. Comics and young adult fiction need to be easy to read and easy to access, and this is something that I make a point of doing in books like my ISIS series, where you can pretty much pick up any book and just start reading, and the story is self-contained in a single book with beginning, middle, and end. That's the way comics need to be. But at DC, it's been these big, long, drawn-out arcs and these big events. And I look at the event model, and that's a model that's pretty much run its course for storytelling. Yes, the event model was very effective in the 1980s when editors like Jim Shooter and people from DC's editorial team used it to spur sales on slower selling books by producing this event that crossed over. But the way I see it, that model has pretty much run its course, and it's time to get back to a easier to read model that where the storylines end in about maybe 2 to 3 issues or 4 issues tops, where readers aren't so invested so long into a story. Where people want to see stories move fast, because in this age of internet and all this streaming and stuff, people don't want to sit there and spend 6 months to a year waiting for a comic storyline to finish when TV series pretty much end in May. I mean, TV shows start in September and end in May, but comic storylines start maybe in January and then don't end until next January. And you look at that type of story model, and that's not going to sell comics. That's not going to move comics when you have to compete with television and even streaming TV shows like Netflix, where people can pretty much binge watch an entire TV series and pretty much get all they want out of a storyline. Meanwhile, your comic still has not finished. And that model pretty much has to change back to something where people can pretty much pick up a single issue or 2 issues or at max 4 issues and get that entire story in that short amount of time. And I look at, again, DC Comics story models. In addition to the story models, I look at the way they are approaching stories, and that 1980s, early 1990s approach, that's got to go too. And that's why I say they need a new editor-in-chief in charge, because you need to have somebody with the vision to say, look, we need new models to get new readers in. We need new types of storytelling models, because it's going to be the stories that sell the comics. It's not going to be gimmicks. It's not going to be events. And it's not going to be trash talk from an editor-in-chief. If it's not on the page, the reader isn't going to be interested. They want to see the story on the page, and they want to see the story move very quickly. They want to see the story be exciting, and they want to be able to anticipate picking up the next story. And this is something that the current DC management just doesn't understand that comic fans want. Comic fans want that type of story. They want a story that they can walk into without being bogged down by years of continuity or events that are always so focused on continuity. They want single self-contained stories that focus on that one character's supporting cast, and that one character's adventures. That's what they want from DC Comics. They want that type of model because, again, that type of model allows them to build word of mouth. And that when you have word of mouth, you can then tell friends about how great this book is, and then they can go and find out, what's so great about this character. And another thing that comic fans want from DC Comics is just pretty much stop canceling books. What a lot of the big problems of DC Comics that I see, and even at Marvel Comics, is that no one has the resolve to stay with a publication even during a rough period. The publishing business was never an instant business. Instant sales, usually don't mean anything in the publishing world. Publishing is a long haul business. It is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You do not get instant results. It may take years for a book to find an audience, and it takes a publisher to have a resolve to stand by that book and believe in it so that it can find an audience. I look at, the ISIS series, and this book, some of the books do well, some of them don't, but I still keep all of them in publication because I know that every reader who picks up one book may want to go back in the catalog for the older books, or if they start with a newer one, um, like Night of the Vampires, they may want to go forward and pick up The Bride of Dracula that's coming out, and they want to be able to pick up those titles consistently and not worry about a cancellation. All a cancellation does is give a reader an incentive to stop buying the comic, because if the story ends, they have no reason to keep buying. But if the series continues, they have an incentive to buy the newer issues and an incentive to buy the back issues. And that's what comic fans want, and that's what comic shops want as well. Comic shops are tired of all these reboots and revamps, because when people have the series broken, what they do is they don't buy any more of the back issues, and then again they don't have an incentive to buy any of the newer issues. And when you break the chain, you continuously break the chain at the 36 issue mark or the 50 mark, guess what? I have no incentive to buy the back issues, and I have no incentive to buy the trades, because most people, when they come into comics, they either pick up an older book or they pick up a newer book, and if they find out the series is canceled, then they don't want to continue reading the story. And with all these constant cancellations, people have very little incentive to go out and buy comics. And editorial has to have the resolve to stand behind titles that are struggling and stand behind them, long term. Because again, this is a long haul business, and you have to have a resolve to stay in it. You have to have grit to stay in the publishing business. And I don't see anybody with any grit at DC Comics. I see a lot of people who are emotional, and they're looking for those big 1990s numbers, and that's not going to happen. It's been 22 years since the collapse of the comic book speculator market, and the comic book market has never adapted. And the reason why it hasn't adapted is because they don't have publishing professionals inside it to say how this business runs. The publishing business, again, is a rough business, and you have to deal with a lot of losses in order to get wins, and you have to be able to stand behind titles in order to get those wins. In order for a company like Scholastic to get to the Harry Potters, they often publish a lot of books that don't make it, and they have to use the money that they get from the Harry Potters and the other titles that are successful to pay for those books, and that's usually how the publishing business works. But with the DC's mismanagement, 99% of the titles have pretty much failed, except for maybe Batman, and even he's struggling these days, and there is no real incentive for anybody to come in and invest in these characters or invest in their stories, because, again, editorial just keeps trying to change the wrong things instead of focusing on developing a consistent platform so that the right stories and the right characters can develop, and creators have the space to write those right kind of stories and approach a different type of story model. I look at the story models again, and they're from the 1980s and the early 1990s. And in 2016, the way we tell stories in literature and film and every other medium has changed. And I look at the models, and some people, like myself, we use approaches from film noir or film, or we use approaches from manga or anime, and we incorporate these different models into the mediums so that we can tell unique stories, and that's not being done. Instead, we have a focus on event models from the 1980s, the grim and gritty storytelling from the Frank Miller, Alan Moore period, which has pretty much run its course, and readers have moved past that. This generation of readers want their kind of storytelling. They want their kind of story models. And they want stories that reflect this time, and they're not seeing that from DC Comics. We saw it for a moment with Young Justice. Unfortunately, that show was canceled, but that's what people want in their comics. And I look at the comic medium, and it's not getting that type of approach. Another thing that comic fans want is they just want you know a simple schedule. They want comics to come out on a regular, and again, they don't want those disruptions from cancellations. And another industry that really has been suffering from all of this mismanagement at DC has been the toy collector market. And I'm a toy collector, and my family member is a toy collector, and we bought the DC Universe Classics line, and even DC Direct before then. And then the new 52 came out, and I pretty much stopped buying DC product altogether. Yes, I did buy the Club Infinite Earths in the first year, but when I saw too many Green Lantern characters in the second year, I pretty much dropped the line and started picking up, singles here and there on eBay. But these days, you can't give away a DC Comics toy. In most cases, when it comes down to DC Comics toys, unless they are, you know, classic related or related to the classic TV shows like the Adam West Batman or the Michael Keaton Batman or the Christopher Reeve Superman, no one is really interested in buying DC products. Whenever I go to a Target or a Walmart or a Toys R Us or even a comic store, all you see is DC Comics products pretty much sitting there. The Marvel Legends section is empty. The WWE section is empty. The Monster High section is thoroughly decimated and pretty much has stuff tossed all around, but it's pretty much almost all the good stuff is gone. But the DC stuff just sits there. And the reason why it sits there is because the brand is being mismanaged. The brand is pretty much lost. And people don't have an incentive to go out and buy the figures because they don't know who the characters are, and most importantly, they just don't care who the characters are because of this relaunch that has gone awry. And because this relaunch has gone awry, people, again, these days are indifferent to DC Comics and DC Comics characters. There was a time when people quickly identified Superman or Batman. I don't see that anymore. Yes, there's a Batman v Superman movie, but most of the controversy and the arguing is about how bad the movie is. It's not about people quickly identifying these characters. Even when I go to the toy store, toy section, there's nobody there running out to go and get the figures. There is no rush for them the way I saw with the most recent Marvel Legends line where, again, you go to the store and there's only maybe one or two figures left on the pegs. I've seen entire cases still sitting there. And this damage is extensive through this DC Comics brand. I've seen everything from the action figures to even sundry merchandise like pencils and notepads still sitting there. And this is really extensive damage to this brand. And people want to see change. They want to see this brand get better. They want to see a new direction. They want to see a new focus. And as long as they see Dan Dido, Jim Lee, Bob Harris, and Diane Nelson in charge, they have no incentive to go out here and pick up a DC comic, a DC video game, a DC action figure. They have no incentive to get involved with characters like Superman or Batman or even try to read their adventures. What people want to see instead of a rebirth relaunch is a rebirth at the top with editorial and executive management. They want to see new faces at DC in the editorial and executive branches of the DC brand, and they want to see a new vision for the DC Comics brand. They want to see a publisher who is going to remain silent when he has to remain silent and let the books speak for themselves. And they want to see an editor or a publisher who's going to give creators the space to tell stories that relate to today and adapt these characters so that they can be relatable to readers of today and tomorrow. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.